My name is Pedro Hayes, 32 years old, and last month my father died, leaving behind an $18 million empire. At the reading of the will, my brothers Marcus and Dominic inherited everything: mansions, yachts, cars, while I received only a dusty envelope. Their mocking laughter still rings in my ears as I walked out clutching that pathetic inheritance. Alone in my apartment that night, I finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a bank account number and one line: "This is for the child who was never supposed to exist." Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment where you're watching from, hit like and subscribe if you want to hear how I went from outcast to the one person my brothers now desperately need. Growing up in the Hayes family mansion always felt like living in someone else's dream. My earliest memories are fragments of luxury that never quite felt like they belonged to me. The sprawling Connecticut estate with its manicured gardens and indoor pool was an impressive backdrop to a childhood marked by emotional distance. I was born to Ronald Hayes, a real estate mogul, and my mother Elena, a beautiful woman with Spanish roots, who worked briefly as his executive assistant before they married. She died of aggressive cancer when I was just 5 years old, leaving me with only the faintest memories of her warm smile and gentle voice. My half-brothers Marcus and Dominic, from my father's first marriage to Catherine Reynolds, were already teenagers when I came along. Marcus was 8 and Dominic was 6 when I was born. From the beginning, I was the afterthought child, the unexpected addition to a family that had already established its dynamics. My father never explicitly said it, but his actions made it clear that I was a complication in his carefully structured world. While he would attend Marcus and Dominic's sports games and academic competitions, he'd send our housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, to my school events. Christmas photos would be taken twice, once with just him and my brothers, and then a second with me, included almost as an afterthought. Pedro doesn't have the Hayes business instinct, I once overheard my father tell his brother at a family gathering when I was 12. The other boys, they're cut from the right cloth. This one's different. He hadn't meant for me to hear, but those words cemented what I'd always suspected: I was fundamentally out of place in my own family. My father's business, Hayes Real Estate Development, was worth $18 million at its peak. What started as a small residential development company in the 80s had grown into a significant player in commercial real estate across the Northeast. Ronald Hayes had a reputation for being ruthless in business dealings, buying distressed properties before owners could recover, flipping buildings with minimal improvements for maximum profit, and leveraging political connections to bypass regulations. From their early teens, my brothers were being groomed to take over the empire. Summer vacations weren't for camp or road trips, but for shadowing executives and learning about property law. Dinner conversations revolved around market trends and potential acquisitions. Meanwhile, I was often told to eat in the kitchen with Mrs. Wilson because the men were talking business. "You'll understand when you're older, Pedro," my father would say dismissively if I tried to join in. But as I grew older, the exclusion only became more pronounced. Where Marcus and Dominic excelled in finance and management at their Ivy League schools, I discovered a passion for art and design. I would spend hours sketching buildings, not for their investment potential, but for their beauty and function. When I showed my father a portfolio of architectural drawings in high school, hoping to find some common ground through buildings, he barely glanced at them. Impractical fantasies, he called them. No one pays for beauty when functionality is cheaper. While my brothers drove luxury cars gifted on their 16th birthdays, I saved up for 3 years to buy a used Honda Civic. When they graduated from Harvard and Yale respectively, I attended the State University on a partial scholarship, supplementing with part-time jobs. My father paid my tuition, without complaint, but without enthusiasm, another obligation to fulfill. After college, Marcus and Dominic immediately took executive positions in the family company. I pursued a career in graphic design, landing a job at a small but respected agency in Boston. My modest apartment in Somerville was a universe away from the family mansion where my brothers still lived, coming and going as executives already pulling six-figure salaries. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as the years passed. My brothers' wives, Stephanie and Rebecca, were perfectly matched to the Hayes image with their designer clothes and country club memberships. They would make small talk with me that barely disguised their condescension. "How's the drawing going, Pedro?" Stephanie would ask, never remembering that I worked in digital design, not illustration. Still, at that little arts company, Rebecca would follow up, emphasizing little with practiced precision. My father's health began declining 3 years ago. A heart attack followed by complications from diabetes left him increasingly frail. As his mortality became more evident, I made genuine attempts to reconnect, visiting the mansion weekly despite my brother's thinly veiled annoyance at my presence. During one of my last visits, my father called me into his study alone, something that had never happened before. He looked older than his 70 years, sunken into his leather chair behind the massive mahogany desk. "You turned out different than I expected," he said, studying me with unfamiliar intensity. "I know I've been a disappointment," I began, but he waved his hand dismissively. "Different isn't always what you think." He pulled out a small key from his desk drawer, turning it over in his fingers before returning it without explanation. Sometimes the unexpected has its own purpose. I left that day feeling confused, but somehow hopeful that perhaps my father had finally seen me as something more than an obligation. 2 weeks later, he was gone, a final heart attack taking him in his sleep. And with his passing, the true nature of my place in the family was about to be revealed in ways I could never have anticipated. My father's funeral was exactly what you'd expect for a man of his stature: elaborate, formal, and more about business connections than genuine grief. The St. Thomas Episcopal Church was filled with political figures, business associates, and society members who came to pay respects to Ronald Hayes, the real estate magnate. Black luxury cars lined the street for blocks, and floral arrangements worth thousands of dollars flanked his mahogany casket. I stood at the back during the service, watching my brothers greet mourners with practiced solemnity in their perfect black suits. They looked like carbon copies of our father in his younger days, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same steel-gray eyes and commanding presence. I had inherited my mother's slighter build and warm brown eyes, another visible reminder of my outsider status. Marcus and Dominic both delivered eloquent eulogies about our father's business acumen and legacy. No one had asked me to speak. In fact, when the funeral director had initially approached me, assuming I would want to say something, Marcus had quickly intervened. "The family has decided on just 2 speakers," he said smoothly, placing subtle emphasis on family in a way that somehow excluded me from it. Throughout the reception at the mansion afterward, I caught snippets of conversation about the inheritance. "The old man was worth at least 20 million, one of father's golf buddies remarked to another. "Those boys are set for life." No one approached me except to offer perfunctory condolences. I overheard Stephanie telling another woman, "It's complicated with the youngest one. Different mother, you know. Never really fit into the business." 3 days after the funeral, we gathered at the office of Walter Bennett, my father's attorney for over 30 years. Bennett Law occupied the entire top floor of a downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. The conference room featured a massive oak table that gleamed under recessed lighting, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Marcus and Dominic arrived with their wives, all 4 dressed as if for a business meeting rather than the distribution of a dead man's assets. Stephanie wore a tasteful Chanel suit with pearls, while Rebecca had opted for something from Burberry's latest collection. They sat closest to Bennett's position at the head of the table, while I took a seat farther down alone in my only good suit, 3 years old, and slightly too tight across the shoulders. A few other relatives were present: our father's sister, Aunt Patricia, his cousin Howard, and a couple of distant relations who I recognized from holiday gatherings, but whose names escaped me. They all nodded politely in my direction, but gravitated toward my brothers for pre-meeting small talk. Walter Bennett entered precisely at 10 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio and accompanied by his junior partner. He was in his 60s, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual expression of mild disapproval. He began with formal condolences before getting straight to business. "Ronald Hayes was very specific about the distribution of his assets," Bennett said, opening the portfolio. "I'll proceed with reading the will in its entirety." The legal language washed over me as Bennett methodically worked through the document. I tensed when he reached the substantive portions. The first major bequest went to Marcus, the family mansion in Connecticut, valued at $5 million, along with the 60-foot yacht docked in Newport. Dominic received the vacation homes in Aspen and Palm Beach, plus the collection of vintage cars our father had spent decades assembling. Each property was announced with its appraised value, the numbers adding up like a scoreboard of paternal approval. Then came the business assets. Hayes' real estate development would be divided equally between Marcus and Dominic, each receiving 50% ownership of the company valued at $18 million. Various investment accounts and insurance policies were similarly divided between them. Smaller bequests went to other family members, $100,000 to Aunt Patricia, $50,000 to Cousin Howard, modest amounts to more distant relations. My name hadn't been mentioned once. The tension in the room grew palpable as Bennett neared the end of the document. My brothers exchanged glances while their wives maintained perfect poker faces. I sat very still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. After distributing nearly every asset I'd ever known my father to own, Bennett paused and reached into his portfolio again. He pulled out a small, dusty envelope yellowed with age. And to my son, Pedro Hayes Bennett, read his voice noticeably different. I leave this envelope and its contents to be opened privately. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt eternal. Then Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh that he quickly disguised as a cough. Dominic didn't bother hiding his smirk. Stephanie turned to Rebecca and whispered audibly, "That's it." Bennett handed me the envelope across the table. It was light, containing what felt like a single sheet of paper. My name was written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. The envelope looked old, as if it had been prepared years ago and stored away. "Is there anything else?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Bennett shook his head, a flicker of what might have been pity crossing his face. "That concludes the reading of Ronald Hayes's last will and testament." As the meeting broke up, I sat frozen in my seat, the envelope burning in my hand like a brand of shame. Around me, the others were already discussing practical matters when Marcus and Stephanie would move into the main house, which cars Dominic wanted to sell versus keep. "We're having people over tonight to celebrate," Marcus told Aunt Patricia, his voice carrying deliberately. "Just family, of course." His eyes slid past me as if I were invisible. I finally stood, tucking the envelope into my jacket pocket. No one spoke to me as I walked out, though I felt their eyes following me, some curious, some pitying, some satisfied. In the elevator down to the lobby, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished brass doors. I looked exactly like what I was, the afterthought son clutching a worthless inheritance, while his brothers divided millions. The contrast between my brothers' lives and mine had never been more stark than that afternoon. As I walked to my Honda Civic, now 8 years old with over 100,000 miles on the odometer, I watched Marcus and Dominic climb into their vehicles, a brand new Mercedes S-Class and a Porsche Cayenne respectively. They pulled out of the parking garage without a backward glance, already living in their enhanced futures, while I was left with nothing but questions. The drive to my apartment was a blur of conflicting emotions. Anger, humiliation, and grief swirled together into a toxic mixture that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Traffic crawled through downtown, giving me unwanted time to replay every moment of the will, reading every smirk and whispered comment. My apartment stood in stark contrast to the wealth I'd just witnessed being distributed. A one-bedroom unit in a converted triple-decker in Somerville, it was clean and functional, but decidedly modest. Rent consumed nearly half my monthly salary as a graphic designer. The furniture was a mix of IKEA and second-hand pieces I'd refinished myself. My proudest possession was my computer setup, dual monitors, and a high-end graphics tablet I'd saved for months to purchase. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and pulled out the envelope, setting it down as if it might bite. For hours, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I microwaved leftover pasta for dinner, tried to distract myself with design work, even attempted to watch a documentary on Netflix. All the while, the envelope sat on my coffee table, my father's final communication to his least favored son. Around 11 that night, I finally poured myself 2 fingers of Jameson, a bottle I reserved for special occasions, though this hardly qualified as celebration, and sat down with the envelope. The paper was thin and slightly brittle with age. Carefully, I broke the seal and removed a single sheet of paper. The note contained a string of numbers that appeared to be a bank account, followed by a sort of international routing code I didn't recognize. Below it in my father's precise handwriting was a single line. "This is for the child who was never supposed to exist." I read the words over and over, each repetition feeling like a fresh slap. Not only had my father left me nothing of value, his final message confirmed what I'd always suspected, that I had been unwanted. A mistake, a complication in his life, rather than a son to be loved. I drained my whiskey, the burn in my throat a welcome distraction from the pain in my chest. What was I supposed to do with this? Was it some kind of sick joke? A bank account with nothing in it, paired with a final reminder of my status as the unwelcome child. After another hour of alternating between anger and despair, curiosity finally won out. The account number had an international prefix I vaguely recognized from my limited knowledge of banking. On impulse, I searched online for the bank associated with the code, a private Swiss institution with a reputation for discretion and high net worth clients. Despite the late hour, the website listed a 24-hour service line for account holders. With nothing to lose but my dignity, and that already felt shredded beyond repair, I dialed the international number. After navigating an automated system, I reached a live representative with a crisp European accent. "Good evening, this is Lucerne Private Banking. How may I assist you?" I stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. "I have an account number I need to check on. It belonged to my father, who recently passed away." The representative expressed condolences and asked for the account information. I read off the numbers from my father's note. "And may I have your name, sir?" "Pedro Hayes." There was a pause and the sound of keyboard clicks. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I'll need to verify your identity before proceeding. Do you have the security passphrase associated with this account?" "I don't think so," I said, disappointment already settling in. "I just have this account number." "One moment, please." More typing. "It appears that for this particular account, verification can be completed with your date of birth and the maiden name of your mother." I provided the information, surprised that this was apparently expected and prepared for. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Identity confirmed. I see that you are listed as the primary account holder, with transfer of full access having been triggered upon notification of Ronald Hayes's death, which we received last week." My breath caught. "I'm the account holder, not my father." "That is correct, sir. This account was established in your name approximately 30 years ago with Ronald Hayes as trustee until his death or until you reached the age of 35, whichever came first." "And is there anything in the account?" I asked, bracing for the final disappointment. "The current balance is $157,428,612.43, primarily in diversified investments and currency holdings." I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, did you say 157 million? "That is correct, Mr. Hayes. Would you like me to email you the portfolio summary?" The conversation that followed is mostly a blur in my memory. The representative explained that the account had been managed by a private wealth team for decades, with regular deposits and astute investments growing the initial sum substantially. All documentation would be made available to me as the account holder, and I could schedule a meeting with a financial advisor at my convenience. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence, the piece of paper with its cryptic message now seeming like a talisman rather than an insult. $157 million, nearly 10 times what each of my brothers had inherited, hidden away in Switzerland unknown to them or anyone else in the family. As I examined the envelope more carefully, I noticed something I'd missed before: a slight thickness in one corner of the sealed portion. Carefully tearing it open, I discovered a hidden compartment containing a small USB drive. With shaking hands, I plugged it into my computer. A single video file appeared on the drive. The thumbnail showed my father's face looking directly at the camera. The file was dated just 6 months ago. I clicked play, and my father's image filled the screen. He looked tired but clear-eyed, sitting in his study at the mansion. "Pedro," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in our last meetings. "If you're watching this, I'm gone and you've opened the envelope. You've also likely discovered the account by now and are wondering what the hell is going on." He shifted in his chair, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The truth is something I've kept from everyone for your entire life. "You are not my biological son." The words hit me like a physical blow. I paused the video, needing a moment to process before continuing. When I pressed play again, my father, or the man I'd always thought was my father, continued. "Your mother Elena worked for me, yes, but she was already involved with someone else when we met my former business partner, James Reynolds. Their affair continued even after she and I married. When she became pregnant, I had suspicions, but I didn't confirm them until after you were born." He took a sip from a glass of water before continuing. "Reynolds was brilliant with international investments. We had built several offshore holdings together before our partnership dissolved. When I discovered his betrayal with Elena, I implemented a plan that took years to execute. I systematically took control of his overseas assets, using legal maneuvers and some methods that weren't entirely above board. The money in that Swiss account, it was originally his." My father's expression hardened. "Reynolds died in a boating accident when you were 3 years old. Elena never knew I had discovered their affair, and she passed away still believing I was in the dark. I raised you partially out of obligation to her memory, but also as the final move in a game Reynolds and I had played for years. His son living under my roof, bearing my name but never truly part of my legacy." The revelation was dizzying. Not only was I suddenly wealthy beyond imagination, but the man I'd spent my life trying to please wasn't even my father. The distant treatment, the fundamental difference between myself and my brothers, suddenly everything made a terrible kind of sense. "I never planned to tell you any of this," my father continued on screen. "The money was going to remain hidden, my final victory over a man who betrayed me. But as I've grown older and faced my own mortality, I've realized something unexpected." He leaned closer to the camera. "You're nothing like me, Pedro. You never were. But you're also not much like Reynolds either, from what I knew of him. You've become your own man despite growing up in the shadow of the Hayes name and fortune. There's a quiet integrity to the way you've built your life on your own terms that I've come to respect, however grudgingly." His expression softened slightly. "So I've made a decision. Reynolds' money should go to his son, you. Consider it belated child support, if you will. The Hayes fortune goes to Marcus and Dominic, who are cut from the same cloth as me for better or worse. But you get something they'll never know about, unless you choose to tell them." He picked up a folder from his desk. "In here are all the documents you'll need. Legal proof of your parentage, the original account, establishment papers, everything. It's all legally airtight. The money is yours, free and clear." As the video neared its end, my father, Ronald Hayes, looked directly into the camera one last time. "I wasn't a father to you, Pedro. I don't expect forgiveness for that. But perhaps this final act can serve as some form of atonement. The child who was never supposed to exist has outlived both his fathers now. What you do with that existence is entirely up to you." The screen went black, leaving me alone in my apartment with a truth that had rewritten my entire life story in the span of 15 minutes. The revelation of my true parentage sent me into a spiral of research and reflection. My father's, Ronald's, video confession had been brief but loaded with implications that I needed to understand fully. Over the next few days, I barely slept as I pieced together the story of James Reynolds, the man who had apparently given me life but never had the chance to be my father. In the video, Ronald had mentioned additional documents, and indeed, the USB drive contained a folder with scanned copies of birth certificates, DNA test results, financial records, and legal documents. The physical originals, according to a text file, were in a safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown, accessible with the key that had been in the envelope. The DNA test was particularly jarring, conducted secretly when I was a toddler, showing conclusively that Ronald Hayes and I shared no genetic material. Another document showed that my birth certificate had been altered. The original listed James Reynolds as my father, but a later version showed Ronald Hayes instead. The most disturbing revelation came in the form of a police report about James Reynolds' death. The boating accident Ronald had mentioned so casually had occurred under suspicious circumstances. Reynolds' yacht had sunk off the coast of Maine during mild weather with mechanical failure cited as the cause. The investigation had been cursory at best, with Ronald Hayes providing an alibi that was never thoroughly examined. Had Ronald actually murdered my biological father? The thought was too horrific to contemplate fully, yet the timing and circumstances made it impossible to dismiss. The video confession revealed another layer of Ronald's calculated cruelty. He described his toxic relationship with Reynolds in clinical detail, how they had started as ambitious young developers in the 70s, built an impressive portfolio of properties and international investments, and then had a falling out over business strategy. Their personal rivalry had intensified when Reynolds began pursuing Elena, who had initially been Ronald's executive assistant. According to Ronald, Elena and Reynolds had fallen deeply in love, but she had ultimately chosen security with Ronald over uncertainty with Reynolds. Their affair had continued in secret, however, leading to my conception. Ronald described discovering a love letter from Reynolds to Elena after her death, which had prompted him to order the DNA test that confirmed his suspicions about my paternity. His revenge had been methodical and patient. Using his knowledge of their joint business dealings, Ronald had gradually seized control of Reynolds' international holdings, exploiting legal loopholes and leveraging business contacts who owed him favors. By the time Reynolds realized what was happening, much of his offshore wealth had already been transferred to accounts under Ronald's control. The final insult had been raising me as his own son, not out of compassion, but as a living trophy of his victory over his former partner and friend. The coldness of this revelation left me physically ill, vomiting in my bathroom, as the full weight of being used as a pawn in a decades-long revenge plot sank in. As the initial shock subsided, I found myself in the grip of a profound identity crisis. The man I had spent 32 years trying to please, whose approval I had desperately sought, had never been my father at all. The distance I had always felt, the fundamental difference between myself and the Hayes family, suddenly it all made terrible sense. I wasn't a Hayes. I never had been. But if I wasn't Pedro Hayes, who was I? Pedro Reynolds, a man with no connection to the name I'd carried my entire life. The birth certificate showed my mother had named me Pedro after her grandfather. At least that much of my identity remained intact. But everything else about my origin story had been a carefully constructed lie. Questions about my mother that would never be answered now haunted me. Had she truly loved Reynolds? Had she been planning to leave Ronald for him before her illness took her? Had she gone to her grave never knowing that Ronald had discovered their affair? The woman in my few childhood memories, gentle always, slightly sad, was now an enigma colored by these new revelations. Driven by a need to know more about my biological father, I began researching James Reynolds obsessively. Online archives revealed a man very different from Ronald Hayes. Where Ronald had been known for aggressive business tactics and political connections, Reynolds had built a reputation for innovative urban development projects with strong community components. A profile in an architectural magazine from the early 90s described Reynolds as combining financial acumen with artistic sensibility, creating spaces that serve both profit margins and human needs. He had been an early advocate for sustainable building practices and mixed-income housing developments, concepts that Ronald had always dismissed as impractical idealism. Most surprisingly, I discovered that Reynolds had been an accomplished amateur painter, with several of his works donated to local museums after his death. When I found images of his paintings online, abstract landscapes with bold colors and fluid forms, I felt an electric shock of recognition. They resembled the style of sketching I had gravitated toward in art school, a similarity that couldn't be explained by nurture or exposure. The more I learned about Reynolds, the more I understood why I had never fit into the Hayes mold. My interest in design and architecture, my discomfort with cutthroat business practices, even my physical appearance, all apparently inherited from a man I had never known. Most heartbreaking was the discovery of a newspaper article from shortly before Reynolds' death, in which he mentioned fighting for custody of a young son. No names were used to protect privacy, but the timeline matched perfectly. James Reynolds had known about me. He had been trying to be part of my life when he died. Had his death truly been an accident, or had Ronald eliminated the final obstacle to his complete possession of both Reynolds' financial assets and his son? I would likely never know the truth, but the question would haunt me forever. The money in the Swiss account took on new significance with these discoveries. It wasn't just wealth that Ronald had decided to return out of some belated attack of conscience. It was my inheritance from my biological father, money that should have been mine all along, that would have supported me had James Reynolds lived to raise me himself. As I dug deeper into the financial records, I discovered the hidden fortune's true origin. Reynolds had come from a family with a long history in European art dealing. The overseas accounts had been seeded with old family money, then grown through savvy investments in emerging markets throughout the 80s and 90s. Ronald's victory had been stealing not just a business rival's assets, but a family legacy that stretched back generations. The legal documents on the USB drive revealed one final twist in Ronald's deathbed machinations. He had meticulously created a paper trail, officially acknowledging me as James Reynolds' biological son and rightful heir, while simultaneously ensuring the transfer of the Swiss account would withstand any legal challenge. His final act had been to secure my claim to a fortune that neither Marcus nor Dominic would ever know existed unless I chose to reveal it. The child who was never supposed to exist had just become the hidden heir to a fortune that dwarfed the Hayes family holdings, and as I would soon discover, the timing of this revelation would prove more consequential than I could have possibly imagined. A week after discovering my true identity and hidden inheritance, I was still processing the seismic shift in my reality when breaking news alerts began flooding my phone. The headline from the Boston Business Journal stopped me: Cold Hayes development under federal investigation, fraud allegations, surface following CEO's death. I clicked through to the article with shaking hands. According to multiple sources, Hayes Real Estate Development was facing a massive fraud investigation related to misrepresented assets, tax evasion, and potential investor deception, spanning the past 5 years. The article noted that the investigation had been ongoing for months, but accelerated following Ronald Hayes' death, when certain protected documents became accessible to investigators. The company's stock, which had been publicly traded since the early 2000s, was in freefall. Investors were panicking, business partners distancing themselves, and the financial media was having a field day speculating about the extent of the alleged fraud. Buried in the third paragraph was the revelation that sent a chill down my spine. Financial experts estimated the company's actual value at less than a quarter of its reported $18 million valuation. My brothers had inherited a mirage, a company built on falsified records and financial manipulation that was now crumbling before their eyes. Further research revealed the extent of Ronald's deception. He had been hiding the company's financial problems for years, taking out massive loans against properties that were already leveraged, creating shell companies to hide losses, and presenting a facade of prosperity while the foundation crumbled. The empire he had built was a house of cards that had somehow stayed standing until its architect's death. Over the next several days, more details emerged. The mansion, the vacation properties, even the yacht and car collection, all had been mortgaged to secure loans that kept the business afloat. My brothers hadn't inherited assets. They'd inherited debt disguised as wealth. I watched from a distance as the crisis unfolded, my phone conspicuously silent. Neither Marcus nor Dominic reached out, perhaps too absorbed in their own catastrophe to think about their half-brother with the worthless envelope. Or perhaps they assumed I was enjoying their downfall after years of their condescension. The truth was more complicated. I felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication certainly, but also an unexpected pang of sympathy. They had been raised to believe in their birthright, groomed from childhood to take over an empire that apparently never existed in the form they'd been promised. Like me, they had been pawns in Ronald's elaborate games, though they had at least enjoyed the illusion of favor while it lasted. On the 15th day after the will, reading my phone finally lit up with Marcus's name. I let it go to voicemail. Then Dominic called. Then Marcus again. Over the next 48 hours, they called a dozen times between them, each message sounding more desperate than the last. Pedro, it's Marcus. Call me back. It's important family business. Pedro, Dominic here. We need to talk about Dad's estate. There are some complications. Look, Pedro, I know we haven't always been close, but this is serious. Call me. The final voicemail from Marcus broke the facade completely. Pedro, please. We're in trouble. Everything's gone to hell. The feds have frozen the company accounts. They're talking about criminal charges. We need to meet. Please call me back. I let another day pass before responding, using the time to consult with Sarah Williams, a financial advisor recommended by the Swiss bank about my own situation. She confirmed that my inheritance was entirely separate from the Hayes development issues and legally protected from any claims related to Ronald's business dealings. Finally, I texted both brothers, "I'll meet you tomorrow at 5 p.m., the family mansion." The property that had once been the crown jewel of the Hayes empire looked subtly different when I arrived the next day. Though still impressive with its columned facade and circular driveway, observant eyes could spot the signs of beginning decay, untrimmed hedges, a luxury car under a cover rather than in use, fewer lights illuminating the grounds. Marcus opened the door himself rather than the housekeeper who had always performed this function in the past. The change was jarring, as was his appearance. Always meticulously groomed, my oldest brother now sported several days of stubble and deep circles under his eyes. His designer shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you." He led me to our father's study where Dominic waited. My middle brother looked equally disheveled, pacing nervously in front of the fireplace where a portrait of Ronald Hayes still hung overlooking the room like a disapproving ghost. The room felt different, too emptier somehow. I noticed subtle gaps on the bookshelves, where valuable first editions had stood vacant spots on the walls, where small but significant artworks had hung. They were already liquidating assets. Pedro Dominic nodded, gesturing to a leather chair. "Thanks for coming." I sat, saying nothing, waiting for them to explain why they had summoned me after weeks of silence. The brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them before Marcus took the lead. "I'm sure you've seen the news," he began, sitting heavily behind what had been our father's desk. "The company is in trouble." "Trouble seems like an understatement," I replied evenly. "Federal fraud investigation, stock collapse, frozen assets that goes beyond trouble." Dominic's jaw tightened. "We didn't know. Dad kept us in the dark about the real state of the business. We've been working 18-hour days trying to untangle this mess since the feds showed up. The mansion, the properties, the cars, everything's leveraged to the hilt." Marcus continued, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There's nothing left but debt. We're facing bankruptcy, possibly criminal charges, though our lawyers think we can prove we weren't involved in the fraud itself." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "That sounds difficult, but I'm not sure what it has to do with me." The brothers exchanged another glance. "We've been trying to locate any assets Dad might have hidden," Dominic explained. "Offshore accounts, properties under different names, anything that might help us salvage something from this disaster." "Our attorneys found references to international transfers years ago," Marcus added, "money moving through Switzerland, large sums." The direction of this conversation was becoming clear. They had discovered traces of the money Ronald had taken from Reynolds but couldn't access it. They had no idea that it had been left to me. "And what does this have to do with me?" I repeated, though I already knew the answer. Marcus leaned forward, desperation evident in his posture. "That envelope Dad left you. We think it might contain information about those accounts. A key account numbers, passwords, something that could help us access emergency funds he might have set aside." The irony was almost too perfect. After a lifetime of dismissing me as irrelevant to the Hayes legacy, my brothers were now looking to me as their financial savior. I opened the envelope, I said carefully. There was a note inside. Both brothers leaned forward eagerly. "What did it say?" Dominic demanded. "Was there account information?" I paused, considering my next words carefully. In that moment I had a choice: continue the cycle of secrecy and manipulation that had defined our family, or break it with honesty, however uncomfortable. The note contained a bank account number I acknowledged, and a message: "This is for the child who was never supposed to exist." Marcus flinched visibly at the words. Dominic looked away. "Did you check the account?" Marcus asked, his voice strained. "I did." And both brothers spoke simultaneously. "And I learned some interesting things about our father," I said. "About myself. About James Reynolds." The color drained from Marcus's face. Dominic froze mid-step in his pacing. "You know about Reynolds," Marcus whispered. Another revelation they had known. All along they had known I wasn't their full brother, that Ronald wasn't my biological father. How long have you known? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. Since we were teenagers, Dominic admitted after a long pause. Dad told us, when I was 16, Marcus was 18, swore us to secrecy. Said it would only hurt you to know that it was better you believed you were a Hayes. Better for whom? I asked sharply. Neither brother answered. The account contained $157 million. I said, finally, watching their expressions shift from shock to disbelief to desperate hope. Money that originally belonged to James Reynolds, my biological father. Money that Ronald stole from him and has now returned to me. 157 million. Marcus repeated, his voice hoarse. That's more than the company was worth even before all this, Dominic added, stunned. Yes, I agreed. It seems I've inherited the fortune while you've inherited the facade. You have to help us, Marcus said the words, somewhere between a demand and a plea. We're family regardless of biology. That money could save the company, save our reputations, keep us out of prison. The money is legally mine, I replied. Documented and secured in ways even federal investigators can't touch. Reynolds' money rightfully passing to Reynolds' son. Pedro, please. Dominic stepped forward. We know we haven't always treated you like a brother should, but you can't just let us drown when you're sitting on a life raft. I stood looking between the two men who had spent decades treating me as an afterthought and inconvenience in their perfect Hayes existence. Men who had known the truth about my parentage, but participated in the lie, who had watched their father's emotional neglect of me without ever intervening. I need time to think, I said finally. This isn't a simple decision. We don't have time, Marcus said, desperation edging into his voice. The creditors are circling. The feds have given us until the end of the month to produce documentation or face charges. I'll be in touch within the week, I said, firmly moving toward the door. That's the best I can offer right now. As I left the mansion, I glanced back to see both brothers watching from the doorway, their expressions a mix of hope and resentment. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 decades had been completely reversed in the span of a month. The child who was never supposed to exist now held the fate of the Hayes legacy in his hands. The week following my confrontation with Marcus and Dominic was the most intense period of soul-searching I'd ever experienced. The revelation of my true parentage had already forced me to reconsider my entire identity. Now I faced an equally profound moral decision about the future of the people who had treated me as an outsider my entire life. The easiest path would be simple. Revenge. Let the Hayes empire crumble. Watch my brothers face the consequences of our father's deceptions, and walk away with my fortune to build a new life, entirely separate from the family that had never truly accepted me. Part of me, the wounded child who had endured years of subtle exclusion and outright dismissal, found this option deeply tempting. But another part questioned whether perpetuating the cycle of revenge that had defined my existence would truly bring peace. Ronald had raised me as a living trophy of his victory over Reynolds. Would letting his biological sons suffer financial ruin and possible imprisonment make me any better than he had been? The third night after meeting with my brothers, I called the one person whose perspective I trusted implicitly, my college roommate and still close friend Rachel Chen. A corporate attorney with a razor-sharp mind and unflinching honesty, Rachel had been my sounding board through many life decisions. They're manipulating you, she said bluntly after I explained the situation, using the family connection when it's convenient after treating you like an outsider for years. I know, I acknowledged, pacing my apartment with the phone pressed to my ear. But does that mean I should let them lose everything? Possibly go to prison? Would they do the same for you, if positions were reversed? Rachel challenged. The question hung in the air, unanswerable but revealing. We both knew the likely truth. It's not about what they deserve, I said finally. It's about who I want to be. Reynolds was apparently a man of principle, of artistic sensibility. Ronald was cunning and vengeful. I have both their DNA in my veins, both their legacies in my hands. Which path do I choose? That's the real question, isn't it? Rachel's voice softened. This isn't about saving your brothers. It's about saving yourself from becoming just another link in a chain of bitterness. The conversation continued late into the night, not reaching any definitive conclusion, but helping me clarify the complex emotions swirling through my mind. By morning, I knew I needed professional guidance before making decisions about such substantial financial and legal matters. Sarah Williams, the financial advisor from the Swiss bank, agreed to meet me the following day. In her mid-50s, with a calm demeanor and 25 years of experience in wealth management, she listened carefully as I outlined the Hayes development situation and my brother's request. From a purely financial perspective, investing in a company under federal investigation would be extremely risky, she advised. Even if you wanted to help your brothers, simply handing over money would likely result in it being seized or lost in legal proceedings. What alternatives might exist? I asked. Sarah considered for a moment. You could potentially establish a separate entity to purchase selected assets from Hayes Development properties that still have actual value once the leverage is accounted for. This would provide some capital for your brothers to address their immediate legal issues while protecting your own interests. She outlined a strategy that would allow me to help without simply throwing money into a black hole. It would require careful legal structuring and due diligence to ensure I wasn't inadvertently taking on liability for Ronald's fraudulent activities. The next day, I met with Julian Parker, an attorney specializing in corporate restructuring. He confirmed Sarah's assessment while adding important legal considerations. The Hayes employees are the forgotten victims here, Julian pointed out. Hundreds of people who had nothing to do with the fraud are about to lose their livelihoods because of your father's actions. Any restructuring could potentially save those jobs while still holding the appropriate parties accountable. This perspective shifted something in my thinking. Beyond my personal history with the Hayes family lay a broader human impact I hadn't fully considered. Innocent employees, contractors, and even tenants in Hayes properties would be collateral damage in the company's collapse. After nearly a week of consultations and reflection, I invited my brothers to meet me not at the mansion or any Hayes property, but at my modest apartment. The reversal of our usual power dynamic was deliberate and symbolic. They arrived looking even more haggard than before, the strain of the unfolding crisis evident in their postures and expressions. Marcus eyed my IKEA furniture and framed design prints with barely disguised disdain, while Dominic stood awkwardly in the center of my living room, as if afraid to touch anything. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to my small dining table, where I had arranged documents in 3 neat folders. "Have you made a decision?" Marcus asked, cutting straight to the point as he reluctantly sat in my IKEA dining chair. "I have," I replied, remaining standing. "But first I want to be clear about something. I know you both knew about my true parentage all along. You watched me struggle to connect with Ronald to understand why I never seemed to measure up, and you said nothing." Dominic had the grace to look ashamed. Marcus's expression remained impassive. "We were following Dad's instructions," Marcus defended weakly. "Yes, you always did," I acknowledged. "And look where that's led you. So before I tell you my decision, I want to hear something from both of you. The truth for once in our relationship. Why should I help you, after a lifetime of being treated as an outsider in my own family?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Dominic spoke. "We don't deserve your help," he said quietly. "We treated you badly because it was easier than admitting the truth that Dad was wrong about so many things, including how he treated you." Marcus made a noise of protest, but Dominic continued. "I was jealous of you," he admitted, surprising me. "You had the courage to pursue what you actually wanted instead of following Dad's blueprint. Even when he cut you off from the real money, you built something that was authentically yours. My entire identity has been wrapped up in being Ronald Hayes' son and heir. Now that's gone, and I have no idea who I actually am." The raw honesty was unexpected. I turned to Marcus, waiting. My oldest brother's facade finally cracked. "What do you want me to say? That I was a terrible brother? Fine, I was. That I enjoyed being the favored son, I did. That I'm desperate now, and would say anything to get your help? That's probably true too." His voice broke slightly. "But it's also true that we're the only family each of us has left, and I don't know what else to do." The admission, however, grudging, was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. I sat down and opened the folders. "I'm not going to give you the money," I said, clearly watching their expressions fall. "But I am going to offer you a way forward with conditions. I laid out the plan I had developed with Sarah and Julian, the creation of a new entity, Reynolds Hayes Foundation, that would purchase selected viable assets from the collapsing Hayes development. The foundation would operate under strict ethical guidelines, focus on community-oriented development, and commit a portion of all profits to arts education programs. The foundation will need leadership familiar with the properties and regional market, I explained. You two could have roles in the new organization, but not as executives. You'd report to a board of directors that I would chair, and your compensation would be modest but fair. The restructuring would provide enough capital to address the most pressing legal issues and protect the jobs of innocent employees. It would not, however, maintain their lavish lifestyles or executive authority. This is the offer I concluded. It saves you from total ruin and possible imprisonment. It preserves something of the Hayes legacy while honoring Reynolds' apparent values. It's also the only offer you're going to get. Marcus's face flushed with anger. You want us to work for you like employees after we've run the company for years. Ran it into the ground, you mean, I replied evenly. Following Ronald's fraudulent practices. Yes, that's exactly what I'm offering. The alternative is bankruptcy and potential criminal charges. Your choice. Dominic placed a restraining hand on Marcus's arm. We need time to discuss this. You have 24 hours, I said. The documents are prepared and ready for signatures. After that, I'll move forward with my own plans that won't include either of you. As they left my apartment, I felt neither triumph nor regret, just a quiet certainty that I had found a path that honored both the Reynolds legacy I was just discovering and the better aspects of the Hayes name I had carried all my life. The next day, I received a text from Dominic. We accept your terms. The transformation had begun not just of Hayes' development into something new, but of my own identity as well. The child who was never supposed to exist was creating a future that neither of his fathers could have imagined. 3 years have passed since that fateful night when I opened a dusty envelope and discovered the truth about my origins. The journey since then has transformed not only my external circumstances, but my understanding of family legacy and my own identity. The Reynolds Hayes Foundation has emerged from the ashes of Hayes development as something entirely new. The transition wasn't smooth. Untangling Ronald's web of financial deception took months of forensic accounting and legal negotiations. Federal investigators ultimately brought charges against my father, posthumously clearing the way for a restructuring that protected innocent employees while holding the appropriate parties accountable. True to my conditions, Marcus and Dominic took positions within the new organization, though not as executives. Marcus initially struggled with his reduced status, his resentment palpable in early board meetings. Dominic surprisingly adapted more readily, seeming almost relieved to be freed from the pressure of executive decision-making. He's found unexpected fulfillment in project management, overseeing the restoration of historic properties that the foundation has committed to preserving. The foundation now operates with a dual mission: profitable but ethical real estate development, paired with significant community investment. 20% of all profits fund arts, education programs, in underprivileged communities, a tribute to James Reynolds' apparent values. The Hayes name remains, acknowledging the complicated history rather than erasing it, while the Reynolds edition honors the biological legacy I've only recently begun to understand. My personal transformation has been equally profound. I moved from my Somerville apartment to a comfortable but modest home in Cambridge, a far cry from the Hayes mansion, but a space that reflects my values and aesthetic sensibilities. The majority of my inheritance remains carefully invested, with significant portions directed toward philanthropic causes that speak to both my background in design and my newfound commitment to addressing inequality. I left my graphic design job to pursue an education in architectural preservation, combining my artistic inclinations with a newfound interest in the built environment, perhaps an echo of both my father's influences channeled in a direction uniquely my own. I've opened a small gallery that showcases emerging artists, providing space for voices that might otherwise go unheard in the commercial art world. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my journey has been the reconciliation with my past. I visited the graves of both my mother and James Reynolds, placing flowers and sitting in quiet contemplation of the complex circumstances that brought me into existence. At Elena's grave, I left forgiveness for the secrets she kept. At Reynolds' final resting place, I left regret for the relationship we never had the chance to build. Ronald Hayes doesn't have a grave. His will specified cremation, with no marker typical of his desire to control the narrative even in death. Instead, I've made peace with his memory in my own way, acknowledging both the harm he caused and the unintended gift his final act of revelation became. Without his deathbed change of heart, I might never have known the truth of my origins or had the resources to reshape my future. My relationship with my brothers has evolved into something I never could have predicted. We're not close in the conventional sense. Too much history stands between us for easy familiarity, but there's a measured respect that has developed particularly with Dominic. Last Christmas, he invited me to dinner with his family, a simple gesture that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamic. Marcus remains more distant, his pride still wounded by the reversal of our fortunes. But even he has shown glimpses of growth, particularly in his relationship with his teenage son, making efforts I never saw from Ronald to support the boy's interest in music, rather than forcing him toward business. The most profound lesson I've learned through this journey is that we are not defined by the circumstances of our birth or the actions of our parents. For years, I believed my failure to fit the Hayes mold was a personal deficiency. Learning about Reynolds explained my differences but created a new risk, defining myself solely in opposition to Ronald or in emulation of a father I never knew. The truth is more nuanced. I am neither fully Hayes nor fully Reynolds. The values I hold, integrity, creativity, compassion, were shaped by my experiences, my choices, and my own internal compass. My biological connection to Reynolds may explain my artistic inclinations, but what I create with those tendencies is uniquely mine. The Hayes name gave me certain privileges even as an outsider, and how I use those now reflects my own moral choices, not either father's legacy. There's a freedom in this realization that we can acknowledge our origins without being imprisoned by them. The child, who was never supposed to exist, has found purpose precisely in that existence, creating meaning that transcends the circumstances of his conception. As I reflect on this journey, I wonder about others facing similar questions of identity and belonging. Have you ever discovered that your life was built on hidden truths? How did you reconcile your past with your future? The path to healing isn't linear or universal. Each of us must find our own way through such revelations. If my story resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe if you'd like to follow more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share with someone who might need to hear that our origins don't dictate our destinations, that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from embracing the truth, however complicated it may be. Thank you for listening to my journey from outcast to architect of my own legacy. Remember that sometimes the smallest inheritance, like a dusty envelope, can contain the seeds of our greatest transformation.